Señoras, señores, buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a la última sesión del ciclo de conferencias Europe Talks y a continuación vamos a dirigir la palabra respectivamente al señor Jaume Lanaspa, el presidente de la oficina del Club de Roma en Barcelona, y el señor Pierre-Enmal Brusselmans, cónsul de Bélgica. Pero antes de darles la palabra, quisiera pedir si la gente podrían acercarse un poquito más, así estamos más cerca de los conferenciantes y de toda la actividad aquí esta tarde. Si no les molesta, pues si pueden acercarse un poquito más. Y le doy la palabra al señor Lanaspa.
Buenas tardes. Gracias por ser tan disciplinado. La sugerencia que acaban de recibir está muy bien. Es insólito que en este país seamos disciplinados hasta ese punto. Pues bueno, muchas gracias y perdone la pequeña confianza, pero es verdad que hace más cálido si se ve a ustedes un poco más próximos. Bueno, es para mí un placer darles la bienvenida a esta última sesión, que culmina el ciclo que iniciamos hace ya unos meses con la iniciativa del Consulado de Bélgica en Barcelona. Quiero agradecer a los asistentes por su presencia y a los que no están y están a punto de llegar, ya se lo agradeceré a posteriori, a los ponentes del día de hoy y al moderador, naturalmente su colaboración y su trabajo, y a nuestros socios de manera en particular, al Consulado de Bélgica, al CIDOB, a la representación de la Comisión Europea en Barcelona. A todos ustedes, muchísimas gracias. Para nosotros y para mí en particular, este ciclo ha sido enriquecedor desde el punto de vista intelectual. Hemos aprendido cosas, he aprendido cosas, bueno, y confío que más personas han aprendido porque hemos tenido unos ponentes de primerísimo nivel. En mi caso concreto, mi proximidad afectiva con Bélgica y con los belgas ha aumentado. Hay un círculo vicioso, precioso, entre los seres humanos, que es aquel que empieza por el conocimiento, el reconocimiento y el afecto. Y funciona en el 99% de los casos. Y con los belgas funciona perfectamente, con los franceses funciona también. O sea, es un placer y me siento contento de haber tenido la oportunidad de experimentarlo con ustedes y de tener esta mayor proximidad. También ha aumentado, sinceramente, mi sentido de pertenencia europea. Este tipo de actividades es una manera, no tiene la solemnidad o la permanencia que da de un Erasmus, pero es un pequeño Erasmus hecho a domicilio, hecho a nuestra talla y en nuestra cotidianidad. Entonces, y sin duda, contribuye a incrementar este sentimiento de proximidad. Bueno, todo esto me lleva a concluir, y lo digo muy solemnemente, señor cónsul, la próxima presidencia belga cuenta con nosotros. Podemos repetir el ciclo dentro de unos años. Cuente con ello seguro. Bueno, por lo menos por mi parte, usted verá lo que hace. Bien, en todo caso, muchas gracias. Celebro mucho tener la oportunidad de concluir este ciclo con todos ustedes. Celebro la presencia de nuestro colega de consulado francés también entre nosotros. Cuando usted quiera montar alguna cosa parecida, sabe que estamos a disposición. Y si no, su amigo el cónsul belga le explicará cómo se hace. O sea que lo haremos perfecto. Y también me hace mucha ilusión que esta última sesión esté especialmente dedicada al homenaje a Jacques Delors. En un año que el año que viene se cumpliría el centenario de su nacimiento, ya el año pasado fue la fecha de su defunción. Entonces está en 2024, un año curioso en medio de estos dos eventos, de una persona que sin duda ha sido de los personajes más valiosos de los que hemos disfrutado en Europa. La Unión Europea hoy no sería sin duda lo que es si no hubiera existido una persona como Jacques Delors, con lo cual, objetivamente, hay razones para rendirle homenaje como uno de los grandes constructores, además de los padres fundadores de la Unión Europea, y me permito la pequeña confianza de decir que subjetivamente hay dos peculiaridades de Jacques Delors curiosas. A ustedes les habrá ocurrido posiblemente que hay personas a las que nunca han visto, con las que nunca han hablado y sin embargo les tienen aprecio. Bueno, a mí me pasaba con Jacques Delors. A Delors le tenía auténtico afecto, le tenía afecto. Y por otra parte, recuerdo que a unos 30 años leí un libro que se llama L'unité d'un homme, que es uno de los 5 o 6 libros que más me han inspirado en mi vida. También les ha ocurrido que singularmente, por razones varias, pues leen algo, les impresiona, les llena, les produce placer intelectual, les enseña. Bueno, pues me pasó con este trabajo, este ensayo de Jacques Delors, que allá a mediados de los 90. Entonces me siento realmente feliz de haberlo no conocido, pero de haberlo querido, y me siento dichoso de homenajearle. Y una pequeña referencia de oportunidad a la actualidad francesa. También celebro que a nivel mucho más modesto una persona como el señor Mbappé se sienta obligado a pronunciarse políticamente. Me parece muy valioso que un europeo integrado perfectamente, obviamente, en la sociedad francesa, se tenga la responsabilidad de llamar a sus jóvenes compatriotas a votar en una coyuntura tan crucial como la de los próximos días en nuestro vecino país. Y es curioso que pueda hablar también de un señor que además es jugador de Real Madrid, pero bueno, hay que reconocerle el valor y el coraje político y personal de decirlo. En todo caso, muchas gracias, insisto en mis agradecimientos y buena soirée. Gracias.
Señor Presidente, dear Jaume, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you again for this indeed ultimate lecture of Europe Talks. It was a cycle that we initiated in January at the start of our presidency, and of course in the framework of the Belgian presidency of the Council of the European Union. Quo vadis Europa? Indeed, it has been mentioned numerous times that we are in challenging times. Climate crisis, migratory crisis, crisis of legitimacy, crisis of trust in our democratic system, in our core values, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Gaza, trade disputes with China, competition for crucial raw materials, competition for technology, military and economic espionage. The newspapers are full of anxiogenic reports. Europe, of course, is not immune to this evolution. Election results in various European countries have confirmed that European citizens are also worried. But what can we do about it? Is Europe the solution? How can Europe or the European Union answer to the needs, the fears, the hopes, and the disappointments expressed through the ballot votes of our compatriots and European citizens? Today we have two eminences grise of the EU who both had the chance to work with Mr. Jacques Delors, the former president of the EU Commission, who passed away on the 27th of December 2023 at the eve of the Belgian presidency, and to whom we dedicate this session. Mrs. Nicole de Wandre was until a few weeks ago Chancellor of the President of the EU Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, and Senor Juan Mayo, former Minister of Industry and Energy of Spain, used to also be a conseiller hors classe of the Commission at the time of President Delors. Both will share with us their insights on the méthode Delors, la méthode communautaire, and if and or how this can help the EU for the future. Thus, they will reflect on the way forward to enlarge and to deepen the EU to make it fit to tackle the challenges ahead of us. And we know there are a lot of them. Our last speaker, Mr. Jean-Louis de Brouwer, a former high civil servant of Belgium as well as of the EU Commission, who is currently the director of the European program of the Egmont Institute, will give us his first evaluation on the Belgian presidency, the work which has been done as well as the work which remains to be done. I believe, by the way, it will be a good way to close this series of lectures as we are nearing to the end of the presidency with a nice reception which will be offered on the ground floor here and which is offered by the delegation of the EU Commission here in Barcelona. We will there, as did the Prime Minister of Belgium, Mr. De Croo, and Mrs. von der Leyen at the start of the presidency, we will there break our EU logo. We were very happy that the Escuela de Pastelería del Gremio here in Barcelona with the help of a Belgian company called Puratos, has produced a beautiful logo of the EU presidency in chocolate, 12 kilos of chocolate. So I can tell you there will be enough for all of us. So after the conference, I will all invite you to join me upstairs for this small reception and the breaking of the Belgian logo as a symbol of the end of our presidency. Without further ado, of course, I would like to thank our partners, CEDOP, Paul Morales, which is here, which has been helping us to moderate all the conferences we organized, the Club de Roma, here the office in Barcelona, La Fondation La Caixa, and of course the EU delegation. So I will invite the speakers and the moderator to come on the floor, and without further ado, I will give the floor, of course, to Mr. Paul Morias. Thank you very much.
Molt bé, bona tarda. Bona tarda. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup d'être ici. C'est un plaisir de vous accueillir à Barcelone, de pouvoir avoir le temps de discuter sur l'Europe. Hay traducción castellano-inglés. Yo hablaré en castellano. Y los ponentes lo harán en ambas lenguas. Lo primero es agradecer, por supuesto, la iniciativa del Consulado belga en este ciclo de conferencias que junto con CEDOP, con la buena colaboración, por supuesto, de Jaume Lanaspa y de la Fundación La Caixa y del Club de Roma, hemos podido abordar distintos aspectos de la integración europea. La última sesión que tuvimos sobre cuestiones relativas a desinformación, fake news y el impacto que tienen sobre el estado del debate europeo, y muchos otros temas que hemos ido abordando en este ciclo de conferencias coincidiendo con la presidencia belga del Consejo de la Unión Europea. Por lo tanto, lo primero es agradecer en nombre de CEDOP, pero también a todos aquellos que habéis participado en las sesiones, vuestra presencia e interés en el ciclo. Y clausuramos hoy con también la buena colaboración de la representación de la Comisión Europea aquí en Barcelona, y agradecer también a Manuel Shapiro, por supuesto, su colaboración en este ámbito. Cerramos hablando de uno de los grandes fundadores de lo que es la Unión Europea a día de hoy, Jacques Delors, y su paso por las instituciones europeas como presidente de la Comisión, que ha ayudado a configurar, sin duda alguna, la Unión Europea que tenemos hoy, pero también abordando los retos inmediatos a los cuales ha debido hacer frente la Unión Europea en los últimos meses, coincidiendo con la presidencia belga del Consejo de la Unión Europea, y quizá también en las intervenciones con capacidad para mirar un poco hacia adelante. Hemos tenido unas elecciones al Parlamento Europeo muy recientemente, que nos han dejado un panorama político de sumo interés en cuanto al análisis, pero también en cuanto a los futuros retos del próximo ciclo institucional que inauguran estas elecciones. Estamos hoy mismo debatiendo lo que nuestros líderes, jefes de Estado y de Gobierno, estuvieron informalmente hablando ayer en la cena informal del Consejo Europeo para decidir las próximas personas que ocuparán los principales lugares de responsabilidad, los que en inglés llamamos los top jobs de la Unión Europea para el próximo ciclo. Pero también tenemos otro Consejo Europeo formal, esta vez a finales de junio, donde esta cuestión deberá ser ampliamente debatida y probablemente acordada. Y tenemos también un pleno del Parlamento Europeo en el que quizá, si todo sigue el curso previsto, podremos ya confirmar o no, pero en cualquier caso votar los parlamentarios la nueva presidencia de la Comisión Europea y del segundo mandato, si es así, de Ursula von der Leyen. Por lo tanto, tenemos muchas cuestiones institucionales, pero también tenemos muchas cuestiones temáticas que discutir. ¿Hacia dónde va Europa? ¿Cuáles son sus retos? ¿Cuáles son sus deberes en la lista de temas que ha empezado en esta legislatura anterior, pero que sin duda protagonizarán la primera, desde el Pacto Verde a las cuestiones exteriores, seguridad, defensa, competitividad, mercado interior, transición tecnológica, toda una serie de cuestiones que nos ocuparán en estos próximos minutos de debate. Yo solo tengo que moderar, así que me toca la tarea fácil y voy a hacerlo en primer lugar dando la bienvenida y agradeciendo a Nicole de Vendre, que fue coordinadora política en el gabinete de la presidenta de la Comisión Europea, Ursula von der Leyen, quien nos dará unas primeras impresiones sobre todas estas cuestiones que abordaremos desde el legado de Delors hasta el día de hoy en el Estado de la Unión Europea. Así que le paso la primera palabra a ella y después seguiremos con el resto de intervinientes. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Yes. Hello, is the mic on? Is this mic or this mic? It's okay? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the CAIXA Foundation. Thank you to the Belgian Councillor. Thank you to Manuel for inviting me to share my thought from the experience that I had at the beginning of my career in the Commission in the Central Advisory Group, as it was called, or Shadow Cabinet, that became the Cellule de Prospective Forward Study Unit. So I worked there between 1986 and 1992. And I have a vivid memory, and indeed I'm very grateful for Delors to have had this first-hand experience in the beginning of my career. I think that the heart of his method was very, very active listening, judging, and acting, making the most out of his context. And his main achievement is really that he dragged the European communities, as they were still called, out of the Eurosclerosis phases that was going on. I want to mention this because it's important to remember that we have witnessed this Eurosclerosis moment, and thanks to Delors and the context, other players as well, we stepped out of it. So he got the EU on its feet, walking again, even running. And this movement is an essential component of the European Union. And in that, it may be different from a normal political entity where movement matters less than for the European Union, this famous functionalism, as the founding fathers called it. We have to remember that it is part of our DNA and see how we cope with that in a moment where it is not easy. How did Delors do? He considered three options. He considered relaunching the momentum around the market, defense. Everybody had the 54 failure of the Communauté Européenne de Défense in mind by then, and money, currency, I mean. He started with market. So I think it was it was the lower step, in fact, and it's interesting to see how he used the word, which was at the core of the contrat de mariage, as we said, but he gave it a new meaning. We shifted from common market to single market. And to that, I would say that he's not a founding father. He's the first relauncher. Because for the founding father, the common market was how to make economies of member states so intricate in industries which were very important to wage war against each other, like coal and steel, for example, to make it so interdependent that there is no possibility of making war again. So for the founding fathers, the EU, the communities, was the way to create interdependence in order to prevent, to kill the possibility of waging a war within ourselves. What Delors did when he relaunched the momentum with the market is he turned it into a single market. And this change is with importance, because that means that, in fact, what he proposed then, building on the momentum created by Reagan and Thatcher, to make a big internal market. Together with single market, we also used internal market. So there the point was to create a market of a continental size. And I say that because it's important to realize that industry was the the stakeholder that allowed the momentum to go again. We owe to industry the fact that in the mid-80s, the EU momentum has been relaunched. Member states were stuck somehow. The people were a bit far from what the communities were doing for them, apart from the frontier workers. At that time, the acquis for people was not so big. And so it's really industry who needed a continental dimension for an institution and who saved the EU institution from being redundant or insignificant. This came with a price, and I will come to this price later, but now I stay on Delors' method, because on his method, so he used markets, the same notion, but in a different meaning, building on Reagan-Thatcher momentum, and then he also brought the euro, the Economic and Monetary Union with the Maastricht Treaty. But it's interesting to see that the single market objective was coined before the fall of the wall in 85, more or less, I think, exactly, while the euro became possible only because of the fall of the wall and the perspective of reunification and the reunification of Germany, which was an important element for having Germans on board for the euro. We may wonder, nobody can redo history, but if the wall didn't fall, maybe we wouldn't have been able to deliver the euro. And an essential feature of the agency of Delors was the fact that he was going every weekend, I think, or almost every weekend, back to Paris, and coming back on the Monday morning knowing what Mitterrand, and through Mitterrand, what Kohl wanted or could agree upon. So that intimate linkages between Delors and Mitterrand and Kohl was really at the core of the success of Delors as well. And I think it was his wisdom to know that it's not about being alone and telling everybody, follow me and do what I do, but to have this resonance with other important actors around him. Now, just to finish on sharing, so this impression of why it was so vivid to be in this environment, because he got things going again, I think we are paying a price of this single market relaunch, which is that this is a moment, you may remember, where we had the cake metaphor, for example, or the trickling down theory, this idea that it's by making rich people richer that it would end up making poor people less poor. And we know that this did not turn true because inequalities have increased. But the EU really sort of embraced the liberalization agenda as the European agenda, again, because of the market at the center of the strategy. I know Delors wanted something else. I know he said, on tombe pas amoureux d'un grand marché, but still, this is a dynamic that he has unleashed, despite the fact of being very aware that this had limitations. So some loved it, this neoliberalism, but others resigned to it because they were pro-European, and they had to swallow it, so to speak. But it is true that all these years there was a dynamic. The Commission was playing big enterprise against the member state in the Council, so the power game between Council and Commission wasn't always easy. But indeed, because people wanted Europe to move on, they agreed to support this global agenda. And this may have ended up in having some people feeling left behind. Now we know we want to leave no one behind, but indeed this agenda has left some people behind, and it may be that because of that strategy, that I repeat was the only one I think that could have succeeded. But this is a strategy that has brought about some disappointment by some Europeans, some citizens, that now we need to address later. So that, and it's important then, I think, to remember from that period that we should not straitjacket people of what it means to be pro-European. If we want to be a mature democratic space, we have to allow debate about different visions of what it is to be European and not use this sort of authoritarian argument of what it is to be pro-Europe, and those who disagree with me and what I think is to be pro-Europe are people who are anti-Europe. So I think we need to really maybe show more openness to have a mature public and democratic debate. Now, on the future of Europe, let me share with you that Of course, I speak on a personal basis, and I'm here to share some thought with you and ready to hear debate, question, pushback. But my feeling is that with the Green Deal, we had a huge intuition of how to project ourselves towards 2050 and having climate neutrality in 30 years' time when we were in 2020. But then, with the crisis, and especially with the war, and I feel that we look ahead by really going back to World War II or the Cold War, and we are recreating a world that we have known before. When we speak of like-minded partners, when we sort of dichotomize the world into, I wonder if we drew all the lessons that we could have drawn from the very special end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the USSR. So, for the EU to project itself as a geopolitical actor now, I think there are three challenges arising maybe from the fact that this end of the Cold War has been lived in a certain way that we should look again more closely to see what other futures are possible. So these three challenges. The first one is how the distinction between how the USSR and Russia lived this end of Cold War and how the US and us interpreted the end of the Cold War. So the different perspective, it's normal to have different perspective. This is always true on any issue and real situation. But I think it's important to realize that we owe to Gorbachev the peaceful end of the Cold War. And Robert Gervis, who is a realist scholar, quite well known, and that I read recently his book called How Statesmen Think, because I must say geopolitics was not my area of expertise. So since the Ukraine war, I really invested a lot in reading to try to understand. And so this Robert Gervis wrote, Gorbachev famously declared, I don't know if you heard that or not, prima facie, but that he was going to do something terrible to the United States. He was going to deprive it of an old enemy. And he continues, in fact, so that's Gervis, this American scholar who speaks, what is striking is how little the United States actually changed after the Cold War. And it's true that the US, and maybe us as well, interpreted the end of the Cold War as a victory of capitalism against communism, which is worse, obviously, because the communist system collapsed. But is that a victory or not, necessarily? So the new goal, this opened the way of a unipolar moment, and this is where indeed some, but the majority of the American ruling class, wanted to maintain American primacy. This opened a unipolar moment, we could call it. And I went back to read Brzezinski's article in Foreign Affairs that he published in October 1997. Brzezinski was Carter's national security advisor until 1981, and then a renowned scholar. And here is what he writes in Foreign Affairs in 1997. America's emergence as a sole global superpower now makes an integrated and comprehensive strategy for Eurasia imperative. Eurasia is home to most of the world's politically assertive and dynamic states. All the historical pretenders to global power originated in Eurasia. And then he continues, collectively, Eurasia's potential power overshadows even America's. So he shows the fear of the US to lose primacy and the need to maintain this primacy now that the rivalry between USSR and US collapsed. So he continues, and that concerns us as Europeans. He says, in the short run, the United States should consolidate and perpetuate the prevailing geopolitical pluralism on the map of Eurasia. This strategy will put a premium on political maneuvering and diplomatic manipulation, Brzezinski word, preventing the emergence of a hostile coalition that could challenge America's primacy, not to mention the remote possibility of any one state seeking to do so. So America's primacy is really the core concern of the United States at that moment in 1997. And then I just end the quote because in the western periphery of Eurasia, the key players will continue to be France and Germany. So in that view, France and Germany are just western periphery of Eurasia. And America's central goal should be to continue to expand the democratic European bridgehead. And it's true that reading this paper, I thought, wow, I don't know if you did this already, but from the US perspective, Western Europe is on the west, Japan, East Asia is on their west, Europe is on their east. And so the only way to keep the primacy in the global system is to keep Eurasia under control through its two flanks, so to speak. So that, if this is a legitimate goal of the US, clashes somehow with how we can project ourselves as European Union as a global actor. Can we go beyond remaining just a western periphery of Eurasia in one way or the other? So I say this is the first challenge I would like to propose to think about. The second challenge for the EU is, as a geopolitical actor, is a territorial liquidity. We all know the fact that with enlargements, there is no stability on the territory. And the fact that it is a defining characteristic of geopolitical actors to have this territorial stability and dimension. So there, it's different. We speak of moving frontiers with the enlargement. With the Brexit, it was the other way around. But that is something very, very special and peculiar when we speak geopolitics, in fact. So just keep this in mind, of this territorial liquidity, and what do we do with it? How do we handle that? Can we have relationship with neighbors without necessarily proposing enlargement or not? The third challenge, so the first one is how we deal in our Atlantic relationship with maybe different perspective on the role of Europe. The second is this liquidity. And the third challenge would be to refrain from mimicking nation-state or empire's logic. I think the EU, we know that from the founding fathers, is a peaceful form of coexistence of entities, I don't know if I like to call them member states instead of nation states, who fought numerous wars and constantly changed frontiers within themselves. I don't think it can become a continental sovereign actor by magic. So we have to be careful when we project this desire or utopia that the EU would be like the EU's the US, but on this side of the Atlantic, to think about where are the roots, where do we come from, to see what is possible. Because if we want to build a continental sovereign actor as the EU, it may be like building a house on quicksand because of where we come from and what Europe was before of the EU. That cannot be just erased. And this is where I come back to Delors, because I think the European Union is and will remain an OPNI. OPNI was this objet politique non identifié. You remember thinking of OVNI, objet volant non identifié, when you receive stuff and you don't know where it comes from? So he used to say that the EU, the communities, is an OPNI. I don't know how the acronym turns in English. But I think that this is an OPNI because its raison d'être is in living by relationality and interdependence. So going back to the founding father is recognizing that we need to refrain from the omnipotence utopia. Often sovereignty is understood as omnipotence. And refraining from this omnipotence utopia is the only path to developing our own genuine power and not mimicking what we would like it to be. Just to close, let's remember now a few boundary conditions, which are real stuff of the reality in this 21st century when we look ahead. We should not forget, and I think we don't hear a lot about this now. In the Cold War, we knew we were in a nuclear age. I think we now tend to not speak about it as much as we might need to, or at least think about. So let's not forget we are in a nuclear age. That totally changed the meaningful of waging a war. And keep the lessons from the Cold War in mind now that we are in hot wars. What kind of wisdom was required from the leaders during the Cold War to keep, of course, the rivalry going while avoiding nuclear Armageddon. Europe is part of Eurasia. This does not mean antagonizing the Atlantic relation, of course, but it means that we need to settle how we articulate this with being a Western periphery of the continent. And last, the forthcoming world order will be multipolar. Unipolarity of the US, bipolarity of the Cold War, multipolarity by European countries on the world before that. This is all the past. We are heading now towards a world where we will have several poles, notably because in terms of GDP and population, things have moved. The last World Bank report that goes up to 2022 shows that the G7 GDP is now at 29.3%, while BRICS, they have many more countries than G7, true, but they are at 35.2%. So this economic convergence on the global scale that we have wanted, this was one of the arguments for globalization, to help other countries to lift and raise. Now, some have done so, so we should not turn the economic convergence into political divergence. And to be part of this order, I think this global order, multipolar, no way out, we need to be able to understand others' point of view and take it into account to avoid the kind of surprise, if it was a surprise, for example, that the Global South didn't follow. Well, I think this could be anticipated if we put ourselves sometime in the foot of the other, how they see us, how we see them, and be more reflexive to integrate these mirror images into our reasoning. Because this is important to take into account, just like in normal life of each of us as human beings. How would our life be if we didn't take into account how others see us? I mean, we know it wouldn't work at all, so we should transpose this and apply this also to the geopolitical discussion.
Thank you. So, continuamos entonces con, en este caso, Joan Majó, antiguo ministro de Industria y Energía del Gobierno de España, pero también consejero en la Comisión Europea y habiendo trabajado con Jacques Delors directamente. Joan, tot teu.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon. Mi intervención ya estaba pensada y después de escuchar la anterior, lo confirmo, no en hablar del presente, que voy a hacerlo, pero sino un poco en hablar del pasado. Es decir, hablar de Delors y hacer un intento de ver hasta qué punto cosas que aprendimos de Delors nos pueden servir ahora para el presente y para el futuro. Digo esto porque nos extrañará, nos tiene que extrañar que muchísimas de las cosas que yo podría decir las acabo de escuchar una vez más con plena conocimiento de causa y por tanto quiero que quede muy claro que repetiría, y no voy a hacerlo, muchos de los elementos que he oído. Dejadme hacer una afirmación que puede escandalizar. Me ha satisfecho mucho que Delors se muriera ahora. Es decir, creo que es una suerte para nosotros que coincida la muerte de Jacques Delors con los problemas que ahora tenemos, porque esto nos permite utilizar mucho más el recuerdo de Delors, que ha salido y se ha, engrandecido precisamente porque se ha muerto. Desde este punto de vista, yo quiero situar cuál es mi experiencia y digo además con mucha claridad que yo casi coincidí con mi aventura europea con el periodo que Delors fue el presidente de la Comisión. De los 10 años, los dos del 85 al 95, que Delors estuvo en la presidencia de la Comisión, yo estuve 4 años en el Ministerio de Industria español y 6 años en la Comisión Europea. O sea que prácticamente coincidieron este 85-95 del que estoy hablando. Fue para mí un periodo inolvidable. Inolvidable desde un punto de vista de lo que viví, lo que aprendí, lo que pude hacer o lo que pude sobre todo ayudar a hacer, lógicamente, durante esta época. No olvidéis, seguramente no hace falta que lo repita, pero no olvidéis que el 86 fue el año de la Acta Única, que el 91 fue el tratado de Maastricht, que sin un título especial ni de acta ni de tratado, pero este periodo fue el periodo de Schengen, la libertad de movimientos en Europa, y fue un periodo que puede parecer muy de un sector no importante, pero que es muy importante, que fue el inicio de Erasmus. Estas 4 cosas, junto a otras muchas más, pero marcan mucho aquel periodo. Yo tuve relación personal con Delors, evidentemente no muchísima, pero sí muchísima con su gabinete, con las personas de su gabinete y tuve una relación de 2 tipos. La primera, en la preparación de la entrada de España en la Unión Europea, y la segunda, trabajando en y para, porque yo estuve 4 años en la Unión Europea, como en aquel momento me gusta decirlo porque es bonito, le llamaban conseiller hors classe. Yo le pregunté a Delors cuando me lo ofreció, ¿y por qué le llamáis hors classe? Dice, porque la mayoría de los que tenemos, que no son muchos, son exministros. Y si le llamamos conseller, les parece que es una marcha atrás, y en cambio con el hors classe ya os quedáis contentos de, bueno, vale. Pero estuve estos 6 años muy en contacto con la Unión Europea. Y pienso que los franceses, el gobierno francés o quien fuera, fueron muy acertados, pero cortos, cuando hablaron y empezaron a hablar de les 30 glorieux. Los 30 gloriosos, los años 30 gloriosos. En realidad fueron más de 30, fueron casi 40, porque fue la mitad del 50, 60, 70, 80 y la mitad del 90. Fue más tiempo, pero verdaderamente fue un tiempo en el que se construyó de verdad la Unión Europea. Y en esta construcción, y no me arrepiento de decirlo, en esta construcción intervino tanto Jacques Delors, que sin el acuerdo y el apoyo de Kohl, de Mitterrand y también de Felipe González, hubiera tenido bastante complejidad en muchas de las cosas, porque se pactaron muchísimas cosas con estas tres con estos tres países y, por tanto, vale la pena saberlo. Esta situación hizo que una vez Delors dejó la presidencia, los tres presidentes salientes tuvieran un papel muchísimo menos importante en las cosas que se iban haciendo, como si los países quisieran recuperar un poco su fuerza y no estar tan arrastrados como estuvieron con gusto, pero arrastrados por las inquietudes, las voluntades y la fuerza del presidente Delors. Hay un aspecto, ella lo ha dicho también, que no lo ha dicho ella, lo ha dicho Jaime, uno de vosotros dos, no me acuerdo quién eran los dos, lo del contacto, acercamiento y al final no me acuerdo cuál era la palabra, pero era ya muy de tipo, vamos a llamarle emocional, más que... a mí me pasó un poco lo mismo en un aspecto que no me importa decir. Jacques Delors nació en una familia cristiana y él se sentía cristiano. Jacques Delors tenía una importante actividad en el mundo llamémosle cristiano, pero al igual que ocurrió en España en los últimos años del franquismo, en el que era difícil hacer política y muchos, con una cierta inspiración cristiana, nos dedicamos a hacer política desde las instituciones religiosas. Cuando Delors supe que había estado en el sindicato, uno de los sindicatos franceses, pero precisamente el sindicato católico, pensé, mira, otro elemento, hacer la política buscando aplicar valores cristianos a la realización de los valores políticos que en aquel momento se fueron imponiendo, tanto la libertad, la mejora del estado del bienestar, el crecimiento del estado del bienestar, todos esos. Y al igual que ocurrió aquí, en Cataluña, que 2 o 3 años después de la muerte de Franco se creó el Partido Socialista Catalán, el PSC actual. En aquella época había 4 partidos socialistas, 2 más importantes, otro menos y tal, pero uno de ellos, el más, para mí más interesante, era el socialdemócrata. Y era el que yo había contribuido a la fundación. Y he leído, y lo supe entonces también, que Delors decía que él era socialdemócrata. Os digo todo esto porque os permite entender hasta qué punto el acercamiento a Delors fue un acercamiento que fue mucho más allá del papel formal dentro de la comisión que aquellos 6 años yo viví. En este momento, soy de los que piensa que deberíamos ver y repasar algunas de las cosas que en aquel momento se hicieron, tanto porque se hicieron bien, como algunas otras porque no se hicieron suficientemente bien, y buscar cómo aplicamos este conocimiento a lo que tenemos delante. No voy a hacer una cosa exhaustiva en este sentido, pero sí que voy a citar 3 o 4 cosas que las dejo como... creo que es difícil no aceptar que en este momento el futuro de la humanidad tiene problemas serios de insostenibilidad. Podríamos preguntarnos, si queremos exagerar, ¿la Tierra puede alimentar 10.000 millones de personas? Desde muchos puntos de vista, pues no lo sé. Hay una serie de insostenibilidades en la raza humana en este momento, junto con el planeta, y no, algunas relacionadas con el planeta, pero otras no, que verdaderamente crean esta problemática de insostenibilidad. La ecológica, y es un tema de el cambio del clima y la escasez de recursos. Esta es puramente ecología. Una segunda, para mí una de las más importantes, la social. Los últimos años, todo lo que se ganó, mucho de lo que se ganó durante el periodo de estos 30 gloriosos de los que hablaba, quedó estancado y en algunos aspectos ha ido retrocediendo. ¿Por qué? Por una razón muy simple. Porque después de unos años de una confabulación de la democracia cristiana con los partidos socialdemócratas, se avanzó mucho en estos aspectos que luego desaparecieron, sobre todo por el crecimiento del ultraliberalismo, que nos ha llevado a importantes retrocesos en el mercado del bienestar, en el estado del bienestar, muchos retrocesos en el tema de la igualdad. Durante los años de los que estoy hablando, cada año crecía el PIB, crecía la población, pero crecía el PIB por cápita, es decir, que crecía más el PIB que la población, y disminuía cada año el índice de Gini. Es decir, estos 4 elementos, más población, más PIB per cápita y menos índice de Gini, es lo que de alguna manera reflectó este crecimiento, que además, que más que crecimiento era aumento del bienestar. Y esta es una de las cosas que en este momento está en peligro. Durante un tiempo, cuando había problemas de crecimiento económico, aumentó la desigualdad, pero ahora que vuelve a haber crecimiento económico, sigue aumentando la desigualdad. Y esto crea una insostenibilidad de tipo social, real, pero además mental, porque es muy comprensible que muchísima gente, y muy especialmente gente joven, tiene miedo y está preocupada porque no ve en absoluto claro que vayamos a ir mejorando. Y a veces es un comentario que con los hijos o con los nietos lo hemos tenido. Hoy día estamos mejor de lo que estábamos hace 30, 40 años. Pero en aquellos momentos estábamos peor que ahora, pero la gente estaba más animada porque sabía que cada año íbamos mejor. Y ahora es exactamente lo contrario. Unos años vamos mal, pero hay el peligro clarísimo y, por tanto, la desconfianza de que no vayamos cada vez mejor, sino que podemos ir un poco peor cada vez. Esta es la segunda sostenibilidad que me preocupa. Y hay una tercera en la que tiene mucho que ver también Delors. Durante la época en que yo estaba en Bruselas y estaba con el presidente, fue cuando la UNESCO le pidió a Delors que presidiera un comité sobre el futuro de la educación. Un comité que al final hizo un informe que muchos podéis haber leído o que recordéis, que en castellano se llamaba «Hay un gran tesoro detrás de la educación». Era la traducción directa del informe. Y por lo tanto, Delors venía a decir, junto con la gente que le acompañaba, el tema del conocimiento, el tema de la educación, el tema del conocimiento y el tema de la utilización social de este conocimiento es uno de los elementos fundamentales para el futuro de la humanidad. Y hoy día estamos exactamente en este mismo sitio. Europa ha perdido y está perdiendo muchísimo de poder en el mundo, porque de los recursos fundamentales que se necesita para tener un papel en la futura etapa de la humanidad está precisamente la creación de conocimientos, el aumento del talento, el aumento de los elementos tecnológicos que salen de estos conocimientos y lo que en el tema ya de la economía es los aumentos de productividad que generan este tipo de conocimientos. Cuando hoy día nos ocupamos de Europa, nos preguntamos por Europa y junto a otras muchas cosas, digo una entre paréntesis, porque además es una que yo discutí a fondo en su momento. Europa no puede seguir siendo un ente político basado en un tratado y nada más. Basado en un tratado y nada más. Europa tiene que tener una constitución. Y por tanto, y aquí juega Francia, cuando Francia y en aquel momento los Países Bajos votaron contra la Constitución, yo dije, hay que buscar una repetición y no hacer la ampliación a 20 y tantos países antes de que no entren en una unidad política con Constitución. Bueno, hoy día ya estamos en 27 y además sigue habiendo la posibilidad de veto por un solo. No puede ser, tenemos que tener una Constitución y tenemos que tener un mecanismo que las decisiones se tomen por mayoría, pero no necesariamente por unanimidad. Y desde un punto de vista, con eso ya acabo, desde un punto de vista de lo que estaba diciendo antes, para tener en el mundo y en el futuro un papel de una cierta importancia, hay dos elementos que son clarísimos, que es como que no tenemos suficientes recursos naturales, Europa no tiene suficientes recursos naturales, ni energéticos, ni incluso alimenticios. Europa no tiene suficientes recursos naturales. Por lo tanto, tiene que tener unos recursos mentales, que son estos que yo decía antes, de los conocimientos, la ciencia, la tecnología y la innovación. Este es el segundo. Y finalmente, y con esto acabo, Europa no puede tener ningún papel importante en el futuro mientras políticamente no sea Europa. Mientras sean 27 estados que cada uno tiene sus opiniones, hay que eliminar, hay que cambiar, hay que mejorar la cohesión, sobre todo en lo que es política exterior, respetando las particularidades y las culturas de cada uno. Pero si no es una unidad suficientemente clara, lo que seremos es un conjunto de países irrelevantes y claramente más pobres de lo que podríamos ser si fuéramos todos juntos. Muchísimas gracias.
Lo que es que acortar porque el tercer participante, Jean-Louis de Brauw, que es director en el Instituto Egmont, tiene un avión que coger, así que le paso la palabra inmediatamente.
With your permission, I will speak from the chair, not from the lecture, because I see myself more as a discussant than as a keynote speaker. So, you hinted at me as supposedly elaborating on the Belgian presidency. I will limit myself to say that it was quite successful. Of course, they invited me tonight, so I would not say the opposite. But what strikes me is that we are now at the end of what I would call one single Spanish-Belgian presidency, because many of the achievements during the first semester of this year were prepared by Spain during its term at the end of last year. The opening of the Intergovernmental Conference with Ukraine and Moldova next week was prepared by decision taken during the Spanish presidency. The completion of the huge legislative agenda by the Belgians was prepared, and a lot of steps were taken by Spain, which left a significant legacy, but indeed Belgium was up to the challenge. The strategic agenda, which will be hopefully adopted by the European Council at the end of next week, was already prepared at the Granada meeting of the European Council. So I think that we are now bringing to a close a 12-month, well-integrated and well-prepared presidency. One word about what comes next. I will never be part of any kind of Hungarian bashing exercise. Hungary is a member state like any other. It happens that Hungary will take over the presidency in a period of institutional transition. There will be sometimes in the future a new commission. What happened yesterday evening at the dinner concerning the top jobs might lead to think that it might take a little bit more time than initially expected. The European Council presidency will enter into a transition phase with the new president taking over the chairmanship in November. And the European Parliament will be pretty busy organizing and holding the hearings with the designated commissioner during the first months of the autumn. So any member state, even Belgium, having to take over the presidency in this kind of institutional transition would have its capacity, political and institutional capacity, very limited. So let's keep that in mind. Now, elaborating on what we've heard from the three previous speakers, I'm impressed by how much we live today with the legacy of Delors' times. Maybe not Delors himself, but Delors' times. Many examples were quoted in the two preceding presentations. Single market, of course, by definition. Single market will be front and center in the new strategic agenda that will be presented next week. I mean, the Draghi report, the Letta report. Cohesion policy dates back from the time of Jacques Delors, and that will be one of the key issue around which we are going to build the post-enlargement EU. Environmental policy was launched also under Jacques Delors until it was significantly accelerated, you referred to it, Nicole, by the development, the adoption and the implementation of the Green Deal. Institutional and policies. Many people like to look in a kind of ironical way to the Maastricht Treaty with the famous 3 pillars. But the second and the third pillar are the roots of the area of freedom, security, and justice on one end, and a common security and defense policy on the other end. Enlargement, fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989. Copenhagen European Council, 1993, which sets the scene for all forthcoming enlargement process, including the one that we might be re-entering in the next few weeks. So all that stays with us way long time, well, not so long time, but after Jacques Delors passed the baton to successive president and successive commission team. Now, what is different? You said it, Mr. Minister. And you said also, Nicole, Jacques Delors took over at the time we were still living with the legacy of the so-called Trente Glorieuses. We were fully enjoying the so-called and so infamous nowadays peace dividend at the time of Jacques Delors, when Jacques Delors took over. Since 15 years, we have entered into a period of, that's a nice concept which has been coined by some colleagues of ours, think tankers in Brussels, perma-crisis. Then, reference to another French thinker of the European Union, Jean Monnet, Europe is growing through and because of crisis. It has been offered plenty of opportunity to grow these last 15 years. So indeed, we are venturing nowadays in, I would say, uncharted territories. But when you look at the way we overcome definitely or provisionally each of these crises, it translated indeed into a reinforcement of the European Union capacity. I'm not speaking in institutional terms. The reinforcement of European Union capacity. So clearly, the overall environment in which the EU is developing itself nowadays is different from the one of the time of Jacques Delors. The institutional setting is different because of the Lisbon Treaty. Where is the engine of the EU nowadays? It is the European Council. It is the European Council. I've been a Commission official for 33 years. The Commission has been a good mother for me, so I'm not doing any kind of Commission bashing. But nowadays, and precisely because of the way these crises were managed, the center of gravity, the engine of the European Union institutions is the European Council. Does that mean that the Commission is now taking a step back? Not at all. It simply is redefining in different terms the balance between institutions and member states, the trade-off between institutions and member states, which has been there at each and every stage of the development of the European Union. And the Commission will be all the more influential that it will be skillful in handling this relation with the Member States through its relation with the European Council. And mind you, I am not referring to any kind of suffragette. This is not the purpose of this. This is not what matters in this case. One caveat. Mind the European Parliament. It went a little bit unnoticed, but during the previous legislature, the European Parliament adopted a series of modifications of its rules of procedure to the furor of the member states, which will significantly enhance its firepower in the interinstitutional dialogue with the Commission and possibly with the Council also. I'm not worried about, I would say, the political landscape. Okay, we all think tankers all like to think in terms of doomsday scenario. The doomsday scenario did not materialize after the previous European election, and we can still count on a relatively stable, traditional majority inside the European Parliament. This being said, not so traditional actors will see their weight reinforced in the European Parliament, and I think that a good test to assess whether it has an impact or not will be the hearing procedure of the new, the designated commissioner. We'll see how it will look like. So clearly, I mean, the interinstitutional environment, inter and institutional environment is quite different nowadays from what it was in the Delors times. Now, what is maybe for me, and I will make a shortcut here, the most important legacy, if there is something which remains of the Delors method, it's what you called, Nicole, the openness, what I would call the inclusiveness, which is to try to keep everybody on board at each and every possible stage. Enrico Letta likes to repeat, and I agree with him, that what achieved the internal market is not that much the good connection with of Delors with Kohl and Mitterrand. It's the Delors-Thatcher tandem. They achieved the internal market, and they make it possible. That means that, yes, more than ever, we have to talk to Mr. Orban. More than ever, a connection must be kept with Ukraine in these days. Dialogue and inclusiveness is of the essence. It's not a given. It's not a given. Let me take two possible, should I label them risk? I don't know. Maybe, okay, let's use the word risk. First, precisely the enlargement process. Okay, the ball will start rolling again after June. And the roadmap will be adopted by the Council, and we don't know what is going to be, European Council, what is going to be in this roadmap. I was yesterday evening in a panel with a distinguished representative of Northern Macedonia. I had never realized that Northern Macedonia has been in the waiting room for 20 years. 20 years that they are waiting to be accepted as a member of the club. Okay, so there is a challenge there. Will it be possible to implement the classical merit-based approach and methodology? It seems to be a bit difficult. For instance, myself, I have difficulty to reconcile, on one end, the geopolitical urgency to achieve enlargement when it comes to Ukraine and Moldova, for instance, and the maybe stubborn attachment to all the member states, including Belgium, to the so-called merit-based approach. The timing of both is not compatible. So maybe we shall have to venture into new approach. Stage accession, for instance, is one of these models, which is, by the way, explicitly referred to by the Commission and the President of the Commission when dealing with the new procedure. So there is a risk, the possibility to have, at least in a transition phase that might last, this kind of Europe à la carte that did not have the favor, to put it mildly, of Jacques Delors and his team at the time. Now, the other, and there I would use risk, is an outcome of an election across the Atlantic Ocean that will take place in November. There again, I would refer to the position defended by an Hungarian minister at the occasion of a panel I attended recently. He was asked a question. He said, we bear in mind that there was an emergency meeting of the General Affairs Council in the immediate aftermath of the first election of Mr. Trump 8 years ago, if my memory is correct. That was a mistake, did he say. Mistake or not, I don't know. What matters is that, okay, the American voters will vote one way or another, and it's unpredictable for the time being. I'm not betting on that. I don't know. I really don't know what the outcome of the election will be. But let us assume that, okay, the election is indeed a return back to the business of a Trump administration. And there comes the second risk. And that's the risk that you clearly hinted at, Mr. Minister. That's the risk of a breach of EU unity. I mean, the good old Donald Rumsfeld, old Europe, new Europe, could be back. When Europe squeezed in between a Trumpian administration in the United States and Russia, which is what it is nowadays. The risk will not come of a lack of capacity, that's what you said, Nicole, of us have the EU, handling that situation. The risk will come from inside, from a risk of disunity inside the EU. We maintain unity managing the crisis. We are still maintaining unity when confronted with the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine and its consequences. Might be cracking when it comes to enlargement. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not making kind of a Hungarian syndrome, but Hungary will take over, and Hungary has a very clear position when it comes to enlargement. Their line is to say, we don't think that offering enlargement or membership to Ukraine is a good thing. They say it very clearly. Okay. So, seeds are there, and that could be the second major existential risk for the EU. Now, I will finish by that, and that would be kind of a stupid joke. I agree, okay. We all know that Mr. Macron said in its Sorbonne speech that Europe can be mortal. I try to reassure my students, telling them, okay, look, Macron said 2 years ago that NATO was brain dead. See how it looks like nowadays. So I hope that I'm fundamentally optimist, but I think that bearing in mind the legacy of Jacques Delors, bearing in mind the difference between the Europe of today and what it used to be, what was it, 20, almost 30 years ago, there are signs of hopes and positive optimism. But if we measure rightly the risk we are confronted with and we take all the actions necessary to mitigate, prevent or mitigate the consequences of this risk. I would leave it like that, and again apologizing to all you who have kindly listened to me and invited me also, because indeed I'm going to have to hurry now and catch a plane at the airport. Sorry about that.
Molt bé. Thank you very much, Mr. De Brouwer. You're free to go if you have to. Thank you very much. We have only a few remaining minutes before we have to end and proceed to the more ceremonial part of our event tonight. But something that I take from all of your thoughts that you shared with us, the three of you actually, is this idea that Europe is really in dire need for going from a common framework to a single framework. That was achieved with a single market, and you referred to it at the beginning. But there are many other aspects of European integration where we're still too much common and not enough single. That is the case for foreign policy, defense. That is the case for technology and our capacity to be a power of ideas and a power that puts forward innovation to a large extent. Needless to say, this is still a very difficult area in enlargement. We're still a club very much divided on the prospects for enlargement, on who do we want to welcome in our club. So from common to single is perhaps what the perma-crisis that Mr. De Brouwer was putting forward is what is required right now for the European Union. And I think that this is something that you all share as a diagnostic. Back in time, back in the Delors time, and the challenge that those times had, but also the challenges that emanate from today's world. And I think that this is something that remains part of our lesson learned in the cycle that we have covered in the last few weeks with these Europe talks that we jointly organized. Now, me doy cuenta de que he pasado al inglés por influencia del último conferenciante. Tengo 5 minutos para reaccionar a esta cuestión o coger una pregunta del público, que será la persona afortunada que podrá preguntar una cuestión en los últimos 5 minutos antes de que pasemos a las formalidades por parte del cónsul belga y la remise du drapeau européen al cónsul hongarés. Pero, ¿alguien quiere hacer una breve pregunta, breve comentario? Del público, claro. Yo tengo muchas, pero voy a abstenerme. ¿No? ¿Estáis todos satisfechos con las intervenciones existentes? Entonces, Voy a agradecer muchísimo a los conferenciantes y también al señor de Brouwer que se ha ido, pero le agradezco desde aquí su generosidad en el tiempo que tenía para participar en este acto. Por supuesto, Nicole de Vandre, muchas gracias. And the interpreter who is back there, very good interpreter, very well known, very good interpreter, by the way. Sitting in Barcelona. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Joan Majó també, moltíssimes gràcies per ser aquí, i al Jaume Lanaspa per la seva hospitalitat, com sempre, aquí a casa seva. Doy la palabra al cónsul general, Emmanuel Brusselmans, de Bélgica, para la formalización del acto de clausura de esta serie de conferencias y de la jornada de hoy. Muchas gracias. Bueno, pues podem quedar aquí. Igual.
Paul y los ponentes, muchas gracias. Before ending actually these talks, I would like to invite my Hungarian colleague and my Manuel to join me on stage, because then I would also like to invite you all to raise for the European hymn, because I think it's a nice way to end our presidency by actually playing the European hymn. It might remind us all the values that we stand for. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, Balázs, please stay here, because this is the moment. I mean, we are at the end of our presidency. You are at the forefront of yours. This little European flag is actually a little present of ours to you.
Very much.
I wish you and Hungary all the best in your presidency. Thank you very much and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to congratulate you to all your work. You've done an excellent job in Barcelona, and I just want to assure you that Hungary will act in a professional and honest way to act as a president to all nations. Thank you.
Thank you.